Oh, wait a minute, I have to see your picture. You have to show me
Yeah.
your 3-year-old picture. Aw, aw, so cute.
Sitting on the stoop in Michigan.
That's adorable. Yeah. I've used your example many times, in terms of the contagion of polio and sort of the oddness of the contagion. That I've pointed out, well, there was two cases in Michigan, and one was way down there, and one was way up there, and what sense does that
The
make?
randomness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because it's like the best example I've ever seen of that. Yeah, I use that a lot.
Do you want to open and say a couple of thank you? Say a couple of things and I'll say a couple of things and we'll open it.
We could do that. What I was going to talk about was, how to talk about your disability in friendship situations or with new people or with people you already know, and how to deal with the elephant in the room. So I don't know if that goes first or...
Actually second, I think.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
I was thinking
Okay.
family went first myself.
Okay.
Because usually it does.
Actually, I was going to hold it.
Because it was ringing because it's proximity.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. Well, good morning. We're going to get started. Welcome. I'm Rhoda Olkin, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some general things in terms of polio, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague who will say a couple of things about relationships. And then we're really hoping that this is going to be a conversation hour. We've passed around some pieces of paper. We encourage you to write questions, but also we're hoping we'll have a discussion today. I have a PowerPoint, which you won't see. So it has a really cute picture of me as 3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie. She's going to go, aw.
Aw.
Thank you. On behalf of everyone.
It's really cute.
Oh, good.
It's probably on the drive.
The first thing I want to talk about is what does it mean when we say that disability is a social construct? Well, I have a lot of roles. I'm a mother. I'm a psychologist. I'm a program director. I'm a gardener. I'm an avid hobbyist, and my disability is more or less relevant in each of these different roles. So how disabled I am is really dependent on the environment and the situation. I had polio in 1954, a year before the vaccine came out, and like many of you, I was probably taught, use it or lose it. You were going to have to exercise and use it or the muscles would atrophy. And then as time went on, we all learned about no pain, no gain. But there was always this idea that people with polio push themselves, you do as much as you can. And then all of a sudden, in the mid-'80s, we learned conserve it to preserve it. Work smarter, not harder. An entirely different way of being in the world. Now, instead of pushing yourself to the max, getting overtired, now it was learn your max and stop before that. And so, with this new, for those of you who have post-polio, with the new triad of pain, fatigue, and weakness, it meant a different lifestyle. I once hiked 3.5 miles up a mountain in Yosemite and 3.5 miles down. This was now a whole new way of being. As I aged and as I got weaker and more fatigue, I started to develop sleep problems. I had breathing problems. Some of you might have carpal tunnel syndrome. So now, what does that mean for sort of our quality of life? We now had functional limitations when all my life I was raised, as probably you were, to think you can do and be anything you want to be. I had to change my lifestyle. So for example, I used to do woodworking. The first time my hand slipped with an electric saw, I gave up woodworking. It changes family patterns. Am I the one that people drive up to the restaurant and then let me off and then they go park? Or do I go with them and then we all walk from the parking lot? Well, now it's a change in family dynamics. My children, I think their first word was curb cut. In addition, There's some re-experiencing of early trauma. You know, I had hospitalizations at age 1, at age 3, at age 7, at age 16, and just going in for childbirth sort of reawakened some of that early trauma for me of what it was like to be a patient, to be helpless, to be young, and to have no power. I had separation anxiety as a child. I now have children and cats, and now I have separation anxiety for them, on their behalf. I think to myself, my cats have no idea when I leave in the morning if I'm coming back in an hour or in 4 days. How awful that must be for them. And then I get traumatized. I know the answer is don't have cats, but...
No, that's not the answer.
And then you did these things as a child to avoid having to use a wheelchair or a scooter. And oh, look what we're using now. I use a wheelchair at work. I use a scooter when I travel. I use crutches. I use all those assistive devices I was working so hard to avoid. And that's a tremendous change in socio-cultural interactions. People treat you differently when you're seated. I never got patted on the head when I was walking on crutches. I get patted on the head now. So what does this all mean for our quality of life? Well, if you think about the main areas in our lives, love, work, finances, family, play and relaxation, physical, medical, and aging. Disability is going to affect us in almost every sphere of our lives as we age. But your quality of life can't be decontextualized. You can't think of quality of life separate from how you think of yourself as a person with polio, because the polio is going to directly affect all these different areas that go into the quality of life. So we have to think about how do we live well as we age with polio. So my motto has been change your mind to change your life. That is, you have to think differently about yourself than maybe you were taught to when you were younger. How do you think about yourself, and what is your role in the family? And I have some very specific suggestions. It's going to sound terribly easy, but it's hard to implement. So the first one is, don't fall. Okay? Which means putting in things in your home before you fall. Get the roll-in shower. Get the grab bars. Get the ramps. Get all those things, the outside banister. All of those things before, like I did, you slip, hit your head, and lie there and think, God, the phone is really far away. Secondly, combat depression. I know that of the questions that we get in our answer column, it is sometimes hard to tease out what is depression, clinical depression, and what is just readjustment to a new level of disability. Depression is treatable, the disability is not. So if you can tease that out, get the depression treated, because it is a treatable condition. And then third, promote well-being. I know that as I gave certain things up, like woodworking or less gardening, I also gave up some amount of socialization, but that's the area you don't want to give up, because study after study shows that socialization is one of the things for older adults that keeps them going, that is attached to well-being and longer life. So, give up something else like cleaning the kitchen, but don't give up the socialization. So I'm going to stop there, turn it over to my colleague, and then we'll open it for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, you left me with a great opening line. When people come to see me for evaluations at the polio clinic, one of the first things that I say to them after I point out that I'm the only person in the clinic who actually was old enough by 1 year to have gotten polio myself, although I didn't, fortunately, I always say after that no one should give up the things that give their lives light and color. And sometimes it's sort of interesting because I'll have the spouse in the room and I'll look over and I'll say, and maybe you'd like to do some dishes or floors or something. Or maybe the person will have beat me to it and said, honey, you might want to take on a few more chores. But Rhoda is absolutely correct. Never give up the things that give your life light and color. That's the most important thing you can be doing. And what I was going to talk a little bit about was, communicating with the people in your life about your disability. Because, of course, this becomes the elephant in the room. And just, the reactions that people have. And I have to tell you, I just had the most wonderful experience this morning with Rhoda. I have to share this. We were tearing up paper for your questions. And Rhoda said to me, we need to get an AB to pass out the papers. And I looked at her, I said, Rhoda, I'm an AB. And she goes, well, I never think of you that way. And I don't think I've ever been quite so honored. That was, it's wonderful to be among people that feel comfortable with me. And she went on to say, well, you get it. And that's an honor too, because I try, but I also know sometimes, I am still the outsider in many ways. So how to communicate about your disability when people are patting you on the head or looking down upon you or doing other things. By the way, there's a book by someone with MS that was titled Waist High in the World. And she said she wished she could have called it Crotch High in the World, but she didn't think the publisher was going to let her. How do you live with that? How do you relate? And especially, how do you relate to people you don't see every day? And there's a range of people, and what do you share with that range of people? Because what you want to tell the person who's patting you on the head, I can imagine what you want to tell the person who's patting you on the head, because as a child of a polio survivor, I've had many fantasies about that my father would never say to people that I would have said, and just try not to. But what do you say to the person you meet casually versus the person that you've known for 50 years, that's an old friend, versus the person that you've just met, perhaps going to a new group because you want to get out and socialize in a new way? And I was thinking about, of course, everybody has their stereotypes and their prejudices. And Rhoda, in her writing, has done a great job writing about the models of disability that people subscribe to. And unfortunately, an awful lot of people, including sadly, I think many of us in this room, in the back of our heads, we're stuck with the moral and medical models, even though we may not believe them anymore. It's sort of the same way as those of us who were raised Catholic. We may still, every spring, around Easter, expect the resurrection. I also expect the Red Sox to win the World Series, which is no longer a joke. That used to be a great joke to go along with the resurrection, but now, of course, it's more like it. Now it's happened 3 times, so can't use it anymore. But, basically, if you're, how you view yourself, your own internalized crypophobia, sometimes sets you up for how you're going to communicate about yourself to other people. Because if you can get to a point where you can non-defensively give some form of response, no matter how big a jerk the other person is being, if you kind of know where you stand with yourself, you will probably be better able to respond to this other person. So working on your issues about that, as Rhoda was also pointing out, is important in dealing with others. But I was thinking, of course, people will have their stereotypes and their prejudices. I run into this now that I've decided not to color my hair. People basically assume that I must be 90 years old. And, I get a little defensive. I still get defensive about this, but I don't get defensive enough that I want to start coloring my hair again. I did recently say to somebody, I look awfully good for 90, don't I? And the person did sort of a double take and said, well, you're not 90, are you? And, oh, wait a minute. It was like I kind of couldn't play the game long enough. If I'd felt more confident about my hair, I could have kept playing the game and had some fun, but there you go. So unfortunately, people with disabilities often find themselves in the role of educator. And you don't want to have to be in that role, but you do end up, especially I think with polio and post-polio syndrome, because the number of times people say to me, oh, don't they have a cure for that yet? Or I didn't think that it still existed. I know you guys get that all the more. And do you have to be the educator? No, of course you don't have to be the educator. But you may want to come up with something along the line of a soundbite or an elevator pitch, as they talk about with entrepreneurs. How can you sum up your situation in 10 seconds or less, maybe one sentence, something nice and pithy? Sometimes you want to be more pithy than others. And you might want to have variants on that for different situations. But how will you talk about it? Also, for people who have less visible disability, this becomes a real problem. People who aren't perhaps needing to use their assistive devices all the time. Now, I do have to say, one of my clients, who's an African-American woman, and is able, she's an upside-down polio, is able to get out of her wheelchair, of course, and stand. And she's been out a few times with her family, and she'll stand up, and people go, and her grandchildren occasionally go, "Hallelujah, it's a miracle," which is fairly awesome. So, you know, I think I'm a big fan of gallows humor. But for people who have more invisible, perhaps all you have is a brace that can be hidden easily under pants, or, you know, something less readily obvious, but you mostly have fatigue. I've worked with some people who their major problem was fatigue, and they're very invisibly disabled. Well, how do you know, people who are invisibly disabled, if they say they're disabled, people look at them and say, "Well, but you look great." "Oh, thank you, I'm cured." So how do you talk about that? How do you decide when to talk about that? What's a need to know versus curiosity? And how does this keep you from getting out and meeting new people? You know, it's important, I think it's important to replenish the stocks of people in your life, because people will be leaving maybe to move to Florida, maybe through death, maybe for other reasons. All your life people are leaving. I think sometimes we're very limited in who we believe can be our friends. I know years ago somebody who should have really known better gave me a very hard time about having a friend who was 15 years younger than I am. Now, I don't think there's any problem with having a friend who's 15 years younger than you are, or 30 years younger. And so, you know, expanding your range of people that you can interact with and expanding your meaning of relationship and friendship, I think becomes ever more important as we age, because after all, we're not going to find so many people who are older than us anymore. It's like being a senior in high school, who are, you know, if you don't like the other kids in your class, you're not going to be hanging out with people who are older usually, unless the janitor's available. But, you know, if you feel worried about how you're going to present yourself to a new group of people, you know, I just would recommend thinking about how will you explain? How will you teach if you feel the need to teach? How will you decide not to teach? I'm leaving you with a lot of questions because there's a group of you, and each of you has an individual answer to these questions. I can't prescribe the right answer for any of you beyond looking at how you want to be in the world, how you feel about yourself, and really not allowing the things that you think might get in the way to be a barrier to going out there and trying. And if they're a persistent barrier, maybe finding someone like me or Rhoda to talk to about it, because as Rhoda pointed out, there's a lot of lingering trauma with polio survivors. That's one of the things I see an awful lot of in my practice, because it's sort of my subspecialty is dealing with trauma and medical trauma and disability. But also, you know, the ways that the age you were when you had your polio may have affected your attachment style, the ways that it affected, you know, separation anxiety, fears about how other people will view you versus how you view other people, allowing them to determine reality instead of determining your own. And you can deal with these issues, you know, either with your friends, your family, clergy, doctors, psychologists, social workers, whoever it may be. You can deal with these issues, and you deserve to have a chance to deal with these issues and get out there and have a good life. So I'm going to shut up because I think I've talked too long, and I'm going to see if anybody wrote down, we wanted people to write down the questions, not to discourage discussion, but so that the questions can be heard on the videotape that's being made. So if anybody wants to hand a question up. If anybody needs paper, yeah. Okay. Okay, so our first question, either of us can, I'll read the question, and then, if you want to answer it, you can feel free to. Can socialization be just as beneficial through social media as through in-person contact?
No. It's not a substitute for in-person contact. It's not bad. It's very good for you. A lot of people keep in contact through social media, but it's not a substitute for face-to-face interaction. They have different beneficial effects. It has beneficial effects, but it's not the same as the face-to-face.
Yeah. I agree 100% with that. I think that it can have an added benefit sometimes of expanding your social network, because I know there's people I've met through being online in different forms that I would never have met in any other way. So, I think that Rhoda's right, though. Any more? Now, I'm happy to come down and collect them. Again, I'm the AB, so I'm happy to walk. Anybody got one? Don't be shy.
We will.
Sure.
Yeah, sure, if you want to.
I would like you to address the feelings. I mean, it's how I view myself, but that patting on the head or patting on the shoulder seems so condescending to me, and I don't know. I always feel like I want to say something, and I don't know how to do that or what to say.
So the question is about when you get patted on the head or patted on the shoulder and it feels so condescending. Excuse me. What are some ways of maybe handling it when you're really not sure you want to say what you're thinking? There's a term in psychology now that's very in vogue called microaggressions. Microaggressions are small behaviors or interactions or the built environment that in some way makes you feel lesser than or inadequate or put down because of your minority status, which in this case is the disability. And that's a microaggression. It borders on an aggression. Handling these are shown to have very bad effects on people's physical and mental health. And I'm actually doing a study now of women with disabilities and their experience of microaggressions. And what we're finding is that they have so many per day that they ignore about 90% of them just to get through the day. For example, one of the people in the group was a little person, and she said at least 5 times a week somebody asks to take her picture. Now, how do you live with that level of microaggression? So, for me, it really depends on who it is. If it's a stranger, I don't want to engage enough to really have a comeback other than get your hands off of me. If it's somebody who's supposed to be, quote unquote, treating me, like, for example, I went to a doctor, okay, in sports medicine. Okay, so it was a doctor. Yeah, see, that to me is more irritating because they should know better.
Should.
That's like patient etiquette 101. I always have what I think the French call the word on the stairs, which is what you think of when you're on your way out that I should have done. So recently a doctor said to me, when he learned I had polio, he said, "Oh, I know a great doctor with polio, and he was a really good surgeon anyway," and blah, blah, blah. And on the way out, I'm thinking I should have said to him, "I'm also Jewish. You want to tell me about all the Jews you know?" But you never think of these things in time. But I do feel with a doctor that I want to educate them because there's going to be the next patient. And yet I feel so infantilized that it's hard to get it together to do what I wish I could do.
But I'm not a patient, I'm an employee at a hospital.
Wow.
Oh, okay. Then you go to HR.
He's the nicest guy, and I think he just is being friendly. So it's like I shouldn't take offense.
So it's,
I love him, he's so nice, but it just kind of makes me
Well, in part because women don't go to men and go like this.
Right.
There is a gender issue there. There is a power issue there.
But you also said, you don't, one of you said, you don't get patted when you're standing tall.
You don't get patted when you're standing and tall. That's right.
Right.
So you need to pull him aside and explain it to him.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something to that?
I don't think I need to add anything to it beyond the fact that I collect horror stories about the behavior of doctors because I get them from my clients regularly, and not too much shocks me anymore. But the idea that somebody would be doing that with an employee, I kind of agree with Rhoda. However nice a guy he is, maybe you do need to talk to HR. Should we?
There's a hand over there.
Yeah, did you? I think you were first.
Would you be able to gracefully redirect this inappropriate pat by taking your hand, taking theirs on your shoulder, and putting it in your hand? Isn't that more acceptable?
So the question was, could you redirect his hand? Could you take his hand and move it to somewhere more acceptable? Do you want to?
I don't know. I think that for a woman, that would feel very odd, because I think even myself as an temporarily able-bodied woman, if a man touches me that I don't want to touch me, the idea that I would then take his hand would kind of have a different meaning. And I would worry that there might be something implied from that. I think I might perhaps say, could you please move your hand? Or I think probably what I'd wish I would say would be, move it or lose it. But I've said that to people that were on a peer level with me. But obviously, part of the problem for you is if you're the secretary and he's the doctor, you're not on an equal basis. And it does. The reason I had the HR response is because it's not an equal basis, and he may need to take that class about harassment.
No, he's just saying, have a good day.
Still, yeah, but it's insult. It's not sexual. No, I wasn't assuming it was sexual. But it's insulting, because would he do that? I mean, maybe the thing to do, actually, one thought I have, and you see what you think, Rhoda, would be to look at him and say, I just have a curiosity question. Would you do that if I wasn't in a wheelchair?
This is an issue that I talk to therapists about, that behaviors that mean one thing to an able-bodied person can mean something different to a person with a disability. And if, in fact, he went up to somebody standing and patted their shoulder, they might take it as friendly, but the meaning of it is different when you're seated.
Right.
And he may not know that. He really may not understand that.
Right.
Yes.
I get very upset when nurses call me hon.
Oh, yeah.
And I hate that.
Okay, so
I feel like a little girl.
yes, the statement is she gets upset when nurses call her hun, and I get that a lot. I also have a nurse who constantly comments on my shoes, because when I'm in the wheelchair, it's sort of the first thing you see about me. Every year, the same thing about the shoes. And to me, it's saying, I'm noticing your disability first. Now, the hun is another example, I think, of the hand on the shoulder, where its meaning is different when you have a disability. It has a pejorative, it has a condescension to it that we may not feel. We might still feel it if we were able-bodied, but we might not feel it in the same way. It takes on a different hue.
Another thing, years ago, when I took my daughter to a pediatrician, he was substituting for her regular pediatrician, and the first thing he said when we walked her, when I escorted my daughter into his office, he took one look at me and said, "Oh, you poor woman." And I had, a few years ago, when we were living in Chicago, dermatologist, and the person who did the intake was a woman. She also walked into the room and said, "Oh, you poor woman." And I let both of them know that I was not a poor woman. And with the woman who did the intake, I also told her boss, that I did not appreciate that a bit.
So the comment is about two different doctors and two different experiences of both of them walking in and immediately saying, "Oh, you poor woman." One of them, though, was in front of your child, and that was a really hard thing for me. Excuse me. I would go to the grocery store, and my child would be 3, and they'd say, "Oh, you have your helper with you today." Well, no, I'm the mom. And then if my children weren't with me, they'd say, "Where are your helpers today?" It's as if there was a role reversal. And I would have to think about, not only did I want to handle this some way, but how did I want to do it in front of my children as a moment that taught them? And that went on for many, many years. Way in the back, the man by the door.
I just have a little trouble understanding that comment, I think you have to have more confidence in yourself as far as your disease is concerned. I'm happy to be a polio patient. I wouldn't do it by choice, but polio has been good to me. I've met a lot of wonderful people. I've done lots of wonderful things, and when I get together with people, I feel complimented by their patting me on the head or what have you. That doesn't bother me, and I can understand that. And I'm a patter, and I've got 6 girls at home, and for me to say, "Oh, it just," that's just normal. It isn't because I'm degrading you. In fact, I think women are absolutely fantastic. The only way this world is going to get better is through evolution and your encouraging us to be more friendly, if you wish. But I don't think you have to feel inadequate. I think that some of the things that I've seen here, the way I include myself that way too, some of the things that I've seen, the way people have handled their disease is just absolutely phenomenal. You're heroes, And I was thinking the other night about survivors. I hate the word survivors because I think it's more than that. I think if I think of us as survivors, then I think we're probably ready to hang it up, but we're not. We've got lots of work to do, and that's one of the things we're meeting at this time. So I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say, but I'm proud to be American. I'm proud to be a post-polio patient, if you want to use that, but it isn't really post-polio. It's post-polio with a small p. Lots of work to do, and we have a chance to change people's personalities, not personality, impressions about us. And I think that if you just go into that conversation a little more aggressively and say, "How's your daughter?" I was fortunate enough to be a physician in a small town, so I got to know a lot of people, and some of them were 2 generations. And so I have a number of ways of working through that. What seemed to be here a demoralizing approach. I don't think that. I think we should be proud of what we've done, and even if we are disabled and have to have someone else roll us over to bed or stick a pencil on the floor.
So let me repeat this because I want to make sure I'm understanding, and then I'll open it for discussion. It looks like some people wanted to respond. This gentleman is saying he has a hard time understanding when we feel belittled or condescended to, that he's proud to be a polio survivor, though he doesn't like that word. And the key sentence I heard was, "and women were wonderful." But that a lot of what sounds like maybe victimization that he doesn't agree with. And I thought I saw a couple of hands. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
Well, I don't necessarily want to respond to that. I do think that I think it's almost impossible to have grown up in a society and not understand sexism and genderism. And so I do it all the time. I try to, as a therapist, I intellectually don't believe it, but I think it's just like racism. You say racism is over in this country, sexism is over. So that, but my question is a little different. One is well, I guess I'm going first. How to deal with what I perceive as need sometimes to overperform in a professional role because of that, the fear that disability is not an asset but a liability, and the importance of self-care. I don't experience it as much now as I did a couple of years ago when I took a new job and had just gotten my assistant device. But the other thing is, I guess it's primarily addressed to you, but do you find ways to draw on your experience? I heard you mention trauma particularly, where I work and deal with a lot of forms of trauma. I work in the VA system. And, do you find ways, either of you all, to pull on your own experiences and still maintain that professional boundary that is so important? How do you do this? This may be more of an offline question. If you feel it is, I'll be consulted maybe to talk about that out with the group. But I just wondered if you've experienced that and ways to kind of draw on your own experiences to deal, to share effective ways to deal.
So there were two questions. One was about the draw to overperform in work, to kind of overcompensate, as you were, for the disability. And the other is about using your own experience, I think particularly as a therapist. So the overperformance thing is a huge issue for me. I'm now a program director, and I never thought I could be busier than I was, and I am. And I'm constantly having to say to myself, not everything has to be done at the A level. I'm late now with things for the first time in my entire life, and I can't stand it. So I don't know that I have a good answer to this, other than that I really relate to the question, and I feel that pull. I have been able to become a specialist in disability, so I do use it in work. I get asked to do talks, et cetera, and so I'm known for that. But so that to me is an advantage, but that doesn't shield me from that pressure to just perform at a really high level all the time. Because when I first go into a classroom, people think I'm the student. They never assume I'm the teacher. And so I have to go in and establish I am the instructor. So I feel that a lot. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, I think, it's funny because as a child of a polio survivor, I think I did take in some of that work ethic, if not, maybe all of that work ethic, people who know me would probably say. I think I'll speak more to the second piece, which is I am a great believer, and we can talk more about this later, but I'll give a quick answer because I think there are some other people in the room it's relevant to. I am a great believer in bringing one's personal experience into the therapy situation. And I always reference back to a colleague of mine, when I was doing my doctoral program application, saying to me, well, you're supposed to talk about your life but not bleed on the page. And I always use that sort of as my reference point, that there's ways of using my experience and my family's experience with polio and with disability in general, because I specialize in working with people with disabilities, and I see a range of people with disabilities. But my biggest credential with people with disabilities, no surprise, is being a family member. You know, it isn't that I'm a psychologist, it's that I'm a family member. So if I didn't share it, actually it very often has helped me to develop trust quicker than I otherwise might have gotten to. But I think you have to do it in certain ways, and that's where we could talk more about it.
I just want to add something to that. I think there are 3 common reactions to the fact that I had polio in my clients. The first one, which helps me tremendously, is they sort of look at me limping or with the crutches or in the wheelchair, and they think to themselves, she has suffered. She is going to understand my suffering. And it may be a prejudice, but it works in therapy. Occasionally I get somebody who says, you have real problems, who am I to bother you with my petty problems? And the third one is, you're supposed to be the expert, why aren't you helping us more? And those are, of course, the hard clients. Yeah. Over there, and then we'll go back over here.
Just a response to the question of a polio survivor, the word survivor. It hit me just now, and I think I will use it the next time. I'm not a survivor. I am a post-polio thriver.
Okay, we're gonna be polio thrivers, not polio survivors. Thank you. Okay,
Yeah.
and back over here, I saw a hand. Yes.
I run a support group, and I think this is probably the topic I get the most questions on. And
Sorry, which topic is the one you get the most questions on?
how to deal with people in your life, your family. I can relate to this lady. I'm short, I have gray hair, and I don't use a cane. And almost every single time I go in the store, I say, "Hi, I'm here to buy needles. Could you tell me where they are?" And they drop to my level and say, "Oh, sweetheart, you want needles or honey? I'll show you where they are, sweetheart." And I was getting so mad about it, I was really afraid I was going to whack them with my cane. So I had to have a little private counseling session. And I think these people, I keep telling myself, they're just trying to be overly friendly to show me that my disability doesn't bother them, but they don't realize how condescending it is. So my daughter suggested that I just change my name to Honey.
I can't even attempt to repeat that other than the suggestion that we all change our name to Honey, which I think is a good idea.
Oh, yeah.
So the question is about, what do you say to friends when you say, I'm too tired, or I can't do that today, and they say, get over it, or I have aches and pains too, you got to push through it?
Well, yeah, that's a simple question. Well, you know, I sort of usually go with that one in terms of the person's, you know, what's your best way of responding? Are you best with, you know, for anybody, are you best with humor? Are you best with information? Are you best with simply ignoring the person? The Miss Manners always recommended that if someone said something rude, you just look at them until they realize they were being rude. And I think sometimes for certain people that can be very effective. But, you know, you could, you know, depending on who's doing the saying, you could always look at the person who says to you, well, I have aches and pains too. Probably the first answer would be, then you understand. That's great. So maybe we won't do that today. And you kind of take them literally, you can take someone very literally at their word and use that. Or you can say, well, and how do yours prevent you from doing this? Or, and what do you think we should do instead that maybe both of us could do? You know, or you can deflect completely and start another topic. But it really depends on the circumstance, it depends on the relationship, it depends on, you know, I mean, again, with the women in the store, there's not much you can do about ignorance, except change your name to Honey.
I have a slightly different answer, which is I honestly do not have any friends who say that to me because I've cut them out of my life. But I should preface that maybe by saying I'm an introvert, and I have a small inner circle of friends, so I'm not somebody who needs a ton of socialization. But in fact, to be in my inner circle, you have to relate to me with my disability in a way that feels respectful to me, or you're not in that circle. I can't imagine a friend of mine saying that to me. It would feel so painful and invalidating.
Yeah.
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 Yes.
I'd just like to say one thing. I wish there was a man up there and not two women talking about how it's good. They don't get that. But more important, I'm from the South, and we call people honey. And it's not
Right.
a sign of disrespect. I've called my secretary honey for years. She knows it's not a sign of disrespect. The girl in the golden gown, I call her honey. And so I think y'all are really super sensitive.
Okay.
Because that's what you want, I think, in my opinion, y'all are way too sensitive.
Okay, let me, and actually I
Repeat it
agree, let me,
first.
actually I want to agree with you on something. I just want to make a
But
point.
repeat it first.
What?
Repeat what he said
Oh, repeat,
first.
okay. The gentleman said that he wishes we had a man up here because a man wouldn't feel the way that women would about this, and that in the South, it is very common, of course, as we all know, to call people honey and dear. And actually, if a Southern man does that, I don't take any offense to it. But the other thing I want to say is I come from Boston. And in the neighborhoods of Boston, I'm a working class kid from Boston, in the neighborhoods of Boston, I'm always going to be honey and dear. And I do not take offense to another working class person from my neighborhood or from the city speaking to me in that way. But that's me. And I think the most important thing, you know, when I was thinking about when you were speaking, and now you, I think everybody has their own take on this. Some people love to be called by pet names. Even, some people even in their marriages do not want to be honey and dear. So I think it's sort of there's a lot of variation on that. And also, if there's a tone and a patronizing tone or a patronizing attitude behind it, that's different than when you're a Southern gentleman. The same as when I'm in the South, I know I'm going to be called ma'am every 3 seconds, and I just know that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I agree with your basic point, which is I think it would be good to have a man answering some of these
Yeah.
questions, because I think the take is going to be very different by men than it is by the two of us, and we do come with a female sensibility
Yeah.
to this. Other questions?
There's a gentleman
Comments?
over here.
Yeah.
Some people call him honey, guys call him, hey, Al, what's going on? Hey, Jack, Mac, or whoever, if you don't know their name, hey,
Right.
Al, what's going on? What's new? So, if you don't know their name, you want to address them somehow.
Yeah.
Instead of, you're not going to say, hi, sir, how are you? Hey, Al, you're going to break the ice a little bit quicker.
Okay.
Or something like that.
So the comment is that this gets done to men too, but the endearments are different. They're, hey, Jack, hey, pal. Mhm.
Yeah. We do have some written questions. Maybe we should do these before we get anyone else. So our first one here is, how can I, quotes politely, decline a request to take on a responsibility or task that I believe will be too taxing for me physically, especially when the requester knows that I have PPS?
Oh, I wish I knew the answer to this. I wish I did this in my own life. Yeah, just say no. We know how that worked on the war on drugs. So my rule for myself is I cannot say yes to anything without a 24-hour waiting period. And that actually has helped a lot, because I'll usually wake up the next day and go, what was I thinking? I will say yes to things in the moment that I know I would say no to if I had a chance to think about it. So now I just impose a 24-hour rule. I'd like to think about that, and I'll get back to you tomorrow.
Yeah, I think especially for those of us who are introverts, I think that respecting your introversion and the fact that introverts process on a long path and need to think about it anyway. Extroverts know off the top of their head, introverts don't. But I agree with Rhoda. It's a good rule of thumb. Now I have two more. I just want to get I'm going to get to you. I just want to read these off because they've been waiting. Oh, you want to comment on that?
Oh,
okay,
sure.
Yeah.
Broadcaster that I know who says when we present a request to him to be on a board or assistant in some way, he says, I give 100%. And if I said yes to you, I couldn't do a really good job. Is that what you want? And of course,
Good
that's
answer.
an easy decision for me. I don't want to, but it's sort of the way it turns out.
So the comment was a director, when he gets asked, says, I give 100% and I couldn't to this. Is that what you want? And most of the time people will say, well, no, we don't want half of you. Though I think a lot of times people do say to me, well, just give it, whatever time you have. But I like that comment.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. That's great. Now this one looks like more of a comment than a question. It's easier explaining things to, quotes, new friends as opposed to friends I have had for 30 years. All friends expect you to be the same as 20, 30 years ago. Or old friends expect you to be the same as 20, 30 years ago. Have the same energy and activity level as 20, 30 years ago. Well, that certainly is true. And then explaining to them that you don't may not be so easy.
So it's easier to explain things, friends that I have in my support group, because if I don't have energy, I say I can't do it.
Got it.
Great. But then my non-disabled friends, I feel like I'm guilted into, come on, one dinner or one whatever. And so now I tend to not associate with them as much, because I don't want to feel that guilt.
Yeah, people do drop out of your life if they really can't handle the answer that you need to give.
Yeah. And I do think that that's when you gave your response of, I don't have friends like that, I think that there's a truth that, the people that are more like that do fall out of people's lives. So, okay, so we got one more written one. This has a number 1 on it, so I guess we have 2 questions. So the first one is, communicating with my spouse about problems I'm having now with polio has been very difficult because my spouse's response almost always leads to an angry response like, well, you don't do this or that, and goes on and on. I'm wanting my spouse to know I'm struggling and need help, although I don't always, or usually know what I need or want. So that's the first question. Yeah. So how do you deal with that, in other words? Yeah. That's, yesterday in the presentation I did, I was talking about how I had to write an article for the Greater Boston Post-Polio Society, and it was about the polio marriage, and I was very grateful. I kept worrying about what my parents would think if they saw it, and it was the hardest article I ever wrote, and I tried to avoid doing it, but I finally entitled it Walking the Tightrope, because I think that the hardest position in the polio family is that of the spouse. The kids have a relatively easy position compared to the spouse, because it is sort of that dance of, I don't know when you want this or that. And I also had said yesterday something about, in marriage, whether we admit it or not, when we get married, what we really want is somebody who reads our mind all the time and always knows exactly, and that's love. That's what we think love is. It is not the truth. What love is learning how to communicate, even if it feels sort of clinical and unpleasant to do it, that you really have to talk about those expectations. And in a situation like this, what it may come down to is sort of every single time asking, is this a day you need the help? Or what do you need from me today? Rather than assuming you know. And that's usually not what the basis of most marriages are, so it's going to feel very weird to make a shift like that in any marriage.
The good news is that in couples in which one partner has a disability and the other doesn't, the sex roles are actually much more flexible than they are in non-disabled marriages. That people have learned to do according to ability rather than according to gender, which is very interesting.
So number 2, the second question on this one was, my spouse makes many wonderful suggestions and I love them. Many work fabulously. Sometimes I know something won't work for me. The response is then, I just want to make, let's see, I think that says, I just won't make any more suggestions. Ah, yes, an oldie but a goodie. And again, it's back to the communication issues that come up in any marriage, because, of course, the spouse making the suggestions believes that he or she absolutely knows what will help and really is just trying to be so very helpful, and then feels so hurt when their helpfulness is rejected. And so they're responding out of hurt when they say, it's sort of like the, okay, if you don't want to play anymore, I'm going to take my ball and go home. And that's the feeling. You feel so let down and so hurt. So again, communication, it's always back, I think Rhoda and I in our column are always going back to the idea of the importance of communication.
Did you want to address this in particular? Yeah, go ahead.
At least my experience as a spouse, and probably this person's experience too, is that what's occurring is that the driver is rejecting the suggestion with great enthusiasm or really anger and negative feeling, all this other unnecessary garbage, when all they really need to do is say, well, that's an interesting idea, but I don't think that's going to work for me. That's not what I need.
Mm-hmm.
The principle that works in many areas of life and business is that in order to find those few great and fabulous ideas, you have to work through just a number of bad ideas.
Mm-hmm.
You just got to go through a whole number of them. And if the polio driver is responding in a way that discourages the spouse from thinking up more ideas, they're really the loser in the long term. So I would encourage those polio drivers in the room to be gentle and recognize that your spouse is going to be a source of many ideas. Some of them not so good, but there may be some few that are going to be truly helpful.
So there were two main ideas here. One is that the heat or the vehemence with which one rejects the suggestion makes a big difference. And the second one is, I think as Einstein said, in order to have a lot of good ideas, you have to have a lot of ideas. So I want to teach you a basic principle in communication of couples, and this is really important, which is there's a difference between the emotional mode and the problem-solving mode. And until you're done with the emotional mode, you cannot move to the problem-solving mode. So the typical couple fight is, and I'm going to gender stereotype here, she says, I'm feeling angry because X. And he says, well, why don't you just, and he offers a solution. And she can't move on because she hasn't been validated, and he feels rejected because now his great idea hasn't even been heard, and it just escalates from there. So really pay attention when you're offering a suggestion, is that what's really being asked for? Or before you would offer that suggestion, Do you need to just validate the emotion or the feelings around the problem? And then together you can move into problem-solving mode. But if you move there prematurely, I can guarantee it's going to be rejected.
Mm-hmm.
I can, my husband comes up, I can take the rest of his time to tell him all the incredible things he's come up with. But sometimes I know something won't work. And my response is, that's a great idea, but I just can't do that because, and sometimes I get that response of, I just won't, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then what do you say when he says, I just won't make any more suggestions?
I really love your suggestions, please don't stop.
Mm-hmm. So she responds, I really love your suggestions, please don't stop. Which in turn validates him, which is very lovely. We have no ideas for you.
Yeah, you guys. I think you guys can work this one out.
Another thing on that first question, you know, when you're explaining about a problem, and then you get all this, well, you don't exercise, you don't do this, you don't do that. And again, I don't know what I need, I don't know what I want, but I want you to know that I'm struggling with something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to be made, yeah, I know I didn't exercise, I know I didn't do that, I know I didn't do those things.
Yeah. Yeah, so when you're feeling something and you're expressing how you're feeling, and then you get sort of a litany of criticisms, well, you didn't exercise, you didn't take care of yourself, you didn't rest, you didn't this, then it feels very invalidating of the emotion you're experiencing. And again, I want to push you back to the expression of emotion and the validation. What we all want when we express emotions is for someone to say, I understand how you feel, and for us to really feel they do understand that. We all need that. And so that's the very basic of what has to happen before you can move from that position.
Yeah, I mean, if you could maybe in that interaction, the one step maybe I would say for you, sir, to add would be, see, I use sir here, would be to say, yeah, I see it's really this is so frustrating, or this is so hard for you. I know you're trying hard, and then say, is there something we can do together to make this different? You know. Right, and then he can say, and then he could say, "Can I make a suggestion?"
That's actually
there
really
we go.
good. Asking permission
Yeah.
to make a suggestion is often a very good idea.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds like you like his suggestions in general, but if you can, each of you need, I think, sometimes we forget because, it's that whole thing of, well, tell so-and-so you love him. Well, he knows I love him. Why don't I have to tell him? Well, say it anyway, because it feels good when you hear it. It feels good when somebody says, in a non-patronizing way, I get it, I feel your pain.
I sort of think men don't say that as much as women.
Mm-hmm.
They're taught to communicate in a very
Right.
different model.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
Mars or
Right.
Yeah.
Or they're taught to detail. I remember somebody talking about how he detailed his wife's car for her, and that was how he showed that he loved her. And I think, it's funny because I think some of the stereotypes, I will say there's some class differences and ethnic and racial differences in these stereotypes, because I think in working class men, you very often get a little bit more expression of feeling, sometimes for better or worse, but you get more expression of feeling, but it varies. I think, of course, the stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason. It is very often the woman in the feeling position and the man in the thinking position.
my husband is the most wonderful man in this room, I'm sorry.
Oh.
And he just has done so much for me and continues to come up with all these things that I know it's not easy for him.
That is awesome. That's why we got nothing for you, because we,
Yeah, really.
we just know, you guys are how it should be.
From the male point of view, cliche, work smarter, not harder.
Mhm.
And, any kind of production factory, employees that are doing the work usually come up with a
exactly.
Something else comes, just like in, around the household chores or something like this.
Mhm.
Well, instead of, standing up, cutting this, piece of carrot, sit down, put a,
Right.
something on your lap and do it.
Right.
It's a two-way
Mhm.
communication that, you come up with a happy medium.
Yeah.
So your idea that certain things work at work actually is a very good one, that at work, what you do try to do is keep coming up with solutions till you find one that works. And that communication element that we're stressing in the marriage, you don't necessarily need to do at work. We're just saying it doesn't work as well in a marriage
Right. Right.
because you have the emotional part with it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, all I could think of is the gentleman yesterday in the other session I was in who had had a Hoyer lift for his wife, and then he discovered that he could buy at Harbor Tools, he could buy an engine block lift that worked just as well and was much cheaper, and this worked great. So it was a good example of problem solving. I don't think you're wrong in the idea of problem solving, and I think that we're all familiar. I think women do this in the workplace too. When in that way. But I think that I think often men get more compartmentalized. So the idea that you get stuck on one way, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything ends up looking like a nail. Learning how to bring that problem-solving style into a relational context is probably the way to do it. If you can kind of make it work with the feelings, again, when like Rhoda said, there's the problem-solving part of the communication and there's the feeling part of the communication, and you have to do them in the right order.
As the spouse, let me put it into a different perspective, and one that I think may have more relevance for the group, and that is as we've gone through post-polio for been together 39 years, and post-polio kicked in 20 plus years ago, et cetera. And I think I mentioned this at our meeting the other morning. It's been gradual. It's been very gradual. There have been changes. We've had time to accommodate those changes. We've done a magnificent job of accommodating those changes. We've built the perfect house with the perfect everything for all of the things we can think of for the last 10 years, and moved in and everything else. But what we haven't anticipated, and we didn't know was going to happen, is the acceleration of that post-polio, the disabling aspects of it came rather suddenly, almost like a traumatic brain injury, almost like an accident, a spinal cord injury, etc. Not overnight, but within the last year and a half, probably a year and a half, maybe 2 years, it's just really accelerated. And we haven't had the time, we have had many of the discussions about what is going on. But what position I find myself in now is that whether the suggestions are precipitated by circumstances that are fundamentally crisis management. We're getting up from a chair. We're about to fall, in my view. We're not about to fall, in her view. But I have trouble reading her mind. I've tried over these years, and we're getting in the car, or we're getting up off the scooter, or we're transferring in the bathroom to the commode, and we got all the bars and we don't have the Hoyer lift, but anyway, it's but it's those moments that this comes out.
Yep.
When we're sitting in the den, sitting in an academic setting like this and talking about things with various people, we have time to take a 24-hour break and think about this and think about that and talk about this, would this work or that work. We're constantly going through, in my mind, crisis management moments, getting in the car, getting out of the car, getting up in the house, taking her the wheelchair on the boat.
we've got a ramp, we've got a pontoon boat specially designed for us, we've got a dock designed for us.
You decide the walkway the right way.
We got it nailed from that standpoint. But we get on the dock, and somebody makes a wide left turn, in my view, not in somebody else's view. Hey, we're on the edge of the cliff, the lake. We have a big dock, and it's great. She's backing up, she's back right into the lake, in my view, not in her view. And so it's in a who's right? Yeah. But the fundamental question that I bring to the group here is, you know, you're about to have a fatal event, not fall, but you're about to have a crisis precipitated, in my view, not in her view, but in my view, and as a caregiver, spouse, husband, et cetera, you know, it's like the Disney employees. They're trained never to scream at a guest unless someone's about to die. Then they say to their employees, go for it. Go for it. And so, with the acceleration of the disability and the challenges we've got there, and the fact that we're active, I mean, we go places, we do things, we get things done, and here we are. And so it's the, I think what's precipitated the real conflict we've had, and it's been a lot, is those moments, not when we're sitting in the chairs, watching TV and having a toddy, but it's those crisis moments when we're going in the hotel room, transferring into the tub, and I say, why don't you do this? She says, I don't think that'll work. I think you're about to fall. You know. So, and that's our perspective, and I think, I don't know whether other spouses have that issue or not, but
So let me unbundle this a little bit, because there were a number of major points in there. One of them is sometimes the rapidity of a decline makes it feel like you're constantly having to readjust. You think you've adjusted, and you know, it's why I hate the term adjustment to disability, because you're constantly doing it. And when it speeds up, it can be scary for both. The other is you use the term, we're getting up from a chair, we're doing this, we're doing that. And I like the way the disability belongs within the couple. I thought that was really very sweet. The third thing is how hard it is to be the partner watching and to kind of sit by and watch. And before I answer some of that, I saw some hands who wanted to respond.
I just want to make a comment. I walked with braces and crutches for 60 years. And I told my friend and my wife, if you see me falling, let me go. I know how to land. If someone tries to help me and grabs an arm, I'm going to break something when I land. You know, if I'm going over a cliff, please land. Otherwise, don't. You know, I'm getting more to the point where she is, you know, occasionally I get into trouble. When I'm in trouble, it's, get in here and help me now. Because, you know, I'm in a precarious, I know I'm in a precarious position. Yeah, I don't say it quite that way. I say, can you come and help me?
Yeah.
And I probably should say, get in now, to tell them that it's more about, you know, it is a crisis and I need help.
And I only yell when it's a lizard in the bathroom.
Well, you're right to do that.
Yes.
So your
Yes, you
comment is sort of let you fall, let you take the consequences unless it's going over a cliff and it's really severe.
I mean, with the crutches, especially, you know, I had this found that if someone tried to grab an arm, it was going to cause, you know, if I'm falling, I can brace myself, I know what I'm doing. If someone's helping me, and I don't expect it, you know, you know, it makes me very uncomfortable.
So sometimes help actually makes it worse, especially if it's unexpected help. It interferes, yeah.
Unexpected and untrained help will kill you. I mean, we've experienced that over time.
Yes.
Good intentioned people talking marching it up from the pew in church. My God, she goes, there are trips and things like that.
I mean, even my wife, one of the places I get in trouble is when I'm first standing up and my pants fall on the floor. I can't get them back up. I've got my braces on. And so, I'm trying to quote Kramer. That, tell me when you're going to do it. Because if you walk up or the back of me and start adjusting something, I'm likely to jump and I am going to go over. It's ahead of me.
This is actually really common among people with different disabilities, which is unexpected help, especially untrained help, is harmful. How many blind people talk about being sort of propelled across the road by somebody who just takes their arm in the wrong way? I think, so you're right. You have to train somebody, this is what works for me.
And what works for me today, I'll guarantee won't work for me.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
So it changes from day to day. So the communication aspect is so important because it's really on an ever-changing basis.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
On this nice little word called suggestions, some foundation suggests something. My God, my wife, she's really not suggesting something. She's really telling you what this is what you're going to do. I mean, she's making suggestions, but she's really saying this is the way we need to do it.
So not all suggestions are suggestions.
Yeah.
Yes. I hear laughter. I have a feeling this is common. We're out of time today. All I want to say before we stop is keep the questions coming. We have enjoyed the columns so much.
Yes.
Write in when you think we get it wrong or we haven't hit it, and keep them coming. We've really enjoyed doing this. Thank you so much for the conversation today.
And thank you all. You've been wonderful.